Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Mr. Harrison here. I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. It just finished for us. This is the day after. Maybe you're eating leftovers. I want you to think about where that food came from for a minute. Where did that matter come from, the energy to create the food that you ate? Well, hopefully, you immediately thought of the Earth, because what we're going to be talking about today, Unit 4, is the Earth systems and those resources, which includes, of course, us producing food. So, first, we're going to get into, I want you to know where we're at. So, if you look at our units, we're down here at Unit 4, Earth systems and resources. You can see that exam weight is about the same as as populations, 10 to 15%. And then you can see the other units that we still have to cover. Here are some topics that we're going to be covering. Today, we're going to be covering plate tectonics, soil formation, erosion, soil composition and properties, covering some skills about explaining concepts, identifying research methods, and describing aspects of research. So to begin with, plate tectonics, maybe you've had some background on that with earth science or some physical science in middle school. We're going to be talking about the geological changes and events that occur at these different plate boundaries, convergent, divergent, and transform plate boundaries. We're going to use visual representations to kind of see what those look like in action. So to recall, to remember, hopefully you've had some exposure to earth science, that the earth is made up of these components. One being the core, which is this dense mass of nickel and iron. It's radioactive. It releases a lot of heat and energy, melting that mantle, which is a liquid layer of magma surrounding the core. And then there's the asthenosphere, which is a solid, flexible outer layer beneath the lithosphere. The lithosphere is a thin, brittle layer of rock that floats on top of the mantle. This is where we spend a lot of our time, either the crust, actually, the crust is where we're living right now, the very outer layer of the lithosphere. If we were to dig down, in looking for minerals, typically those are coming from the lithosphere. So first, the three boundaries you need to know. One is divergent. So this is when plates move away from each other. So they slide past each other. Um, this way, divergent. Um, and rising magma plumes come up and then force those apart. So where is this happening? This is happening places like the mid-ocean ridges, mid-Atlantic ridge, the Rift Valley in Africa, where new land is being formed and spreading apart. Transform faults are when those plates slide by each other. And the key thing to remember is those create earthquakes. Last one, convergent plate boundaries, as the name implies, two plates hit each other, and they can do different things. One is subduction, where one plate actually goes underneath the others. And what those do are create mountains, as you can kind of see in this visual mountain building. So I'm going to be talking a little about that, and volcanoes. So convection cycles are what's driving this whole process. You can see those represented here by arrows. So as magma heats up, it rises to the lithosphere. Eventually it cools and expands that diverging plate boundary. This is happening in the Atlantic. It also is happening in the Ring of Fire. We're going to be talking about that. And forms new sea floor. That magma cools and becomes new lithosphere. Spreading magma has big impact on the planet. It creates it. Eventually, those plates will reach and run into continental plates and do that subduction we talked about earlier. And it also forces magma under where it heats up and then eventually will come back up or force buckling and mountain building on land. Examples are the Andes Mountains in South America. Okay, so here are the three convergent plate boundary responses can be or results. So you see here, you see when oceanic and oceanic plates are coming together, one usually subducts under the other, forces that magma up to the lithosphere, forming mid-ocean volcanoes. These often form what are called archipelagos, or island arcs, like the Galapagos or out in the South Pacific. They can also form those trenches, which are really deep parts of the ocean, unique biologically. Oceanic to continental plates, when they run into each other, the oceanic plate usually is more dense and subducts beneath the continental plate, and that magma eventually reaches down and heats up, and then forces that magma back up. It can form coastal mountains like the Andes we mentioned. On land, it can form trenches. It can also have impact in terms of earthquakes, which we'll be talking about that, and create things like tsunamis. Continental to continental plate boundaries, when those run into each other, they're forming mountains, such as the Himalayan mountains. Okay, so transform plate boundary. What happens when one slides by the other? Earthquakes. So that tension is built up and built up over time, and then eventually that pressure is released. And when that happens, that release of energy is transferred and creates massive earthquakes sometimes in the lithosphere. So where's there a lot of tectonic activity? So you can see here we have the Ring of Fire, which is a location in the Pacific around the coast of the United States, all the way through Alaska and Asia. Lots of plate tectonic activity, lots of things like the volcanoes and earthquakes. And think about Japan. In the case of, Japan has had earthquakes, and it also has been formed by this process. Transform faults are those areas which are most likely to have earthquakes. So they're represented by the orange here, you can see. And we know that Southern California, for example, is often has earthquakes, but we can also find those in different parts of South America. You see scattered throughout in the ocean. There are places that have those transfer faults as well. Hotspots are areas where magma is continuing to rise, and they form those mid-ocean islands such as Hawaii. So we've got some volcanic activity as well. And Iceland, which is a really cool place I would like to visit more. I went through there, but I'd like to spend more time there sometime. Okay, here's a practice FRQ. Explain how subduction leads to volcanic activity. So you can go back over the presentation and see how you do. All right, 4.2, soil formation and erosion. What I'd like you to do for extra credit is go outside, and I'd like you to find some soil. This is soil I got in my backyard. Send me an email with a picture of your soil and where it came from, and I'll give you extra credit. Okay, soil formation and erosion. Here we go. So today we're going to describe the characteristics and formation of soil, our essential knowledge. We're going to talk about parent material, weathering, transporting of soil, and depositing of soil. We're going to talk about how soils are categorized, looking at the horizons, and what are the processes that break soil down. And most importantly is thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner. So where did that Thanksgiving dinner come from? Hopefully you're thinking of the earth. Hopefully you're thinking of soils. So when you think of soils, you should immediately think of natural capital. Soils are extremely important in terms of what they do and what they provide. Not only do they give us food, but they filter our water. They provide a medium for all our vegetation, almost all vegetation to grow, unless it's aquatic, needs that soil to have roots. It helps recycle those nutrients, very essential nutrients, habitat for lots of organisms. plays an extreme important role in carbon cycling. We're going to be talking a little bit about that later. So don't forget natural capital, soil. Soil, what it consists of is mineral, geological rock, and the organic material, the components. And don't forget, there's lots of microbes we cannot see, bacteria and fungi. Can consist of percentages of sand, silt, clay, and this word humus, not humus. It's a little different. Which is the organic matter of the soil, and it's the broken down biomass that accumulates on the top. Nutrients are important. We're going to be talking about ones related to nitrogen, ammonium, nitrates, phosphates. Of course, other non-living factors would be water and air. So how does soil get formed? First, usually there's a weathering process. So rocks are broken down either physically, wind, rain, freezing, thawing, biologically through the action of trees, rocks, chemically, acid rain, acids from things like mosses and lichens can help break down soil, and weathering of rock, which is the soil formation. So that's breaking down that rock even smaller and smaller pieces. Eventually, it's carried away either by the wind, transported by wind or rain, and then it's deposited at a new location. So, soil formation, here's hopefully this reminds you visually a little bit of succession when we talked about that and how primary succession starts. It's pretty much the same process. So, you have a parent immature soil, could be bedrock, and then eventually that soil is going to form over time as material is weathered in the parent material, more organic material, broken down of organic material is added to that soil, the humus, over time. Eventually, those soils will accumulate. The effects of soil formation, what is important to know is what kind of parent material it has. So what kind of rock is it? Is it really acidic? Is it does it contain nutrients, minerals? The topography, of course, is going to influence soil formation. If you're on a steep slope, that soil is going to erode very quickly. It's going to be hard to be maintained. Climate in places like the tropics, for example, there's lots of weathering, lots of rain, and lots of breakdown of organic matter. So in the tropics, soils do not form. They're not very stable. They can be broken down very quickly, be eroded very quickly. They also get oxidized very quickly in tropical regions of the world than they do in places like the United States, where it's more temperate. So effects of climate on soil formation. Of course, the organisms that you can find there, if there are lots of bacteria or fungi, worms, how they all contribute to the breaking down of soils. Soil horizons. So here we've got horizon O, which represents that humus layer, which usually is organic matter that is accumulated on the top of the soil. That's usually helping retain the soil moisture and just protecting the soil. Very important. Down below, we've got the A horizon, also known as the topsoil. That's a layer of humus, organic matter, but also contains the minerals from the parent material. So this is your productive soil, typically your topsoil, your A horizon. Most biologically active, lots of earthworms and microbes. B horizon is considered the subsoil. Usually there's less nutrients, made of minerals. There might be more minerals from the parent rock, but not usually as many organic compounds. C horizon, this is the parent material that has been the least weathered and it's mostly rock. Okay, so soil degradation, what's happening to our soil over time? We have lost a lot of our topsoil. So through farming practices where we're tilling, which means turning over the soil and exposing it to weathering, We're losing a lot of that soil because of wind and rain. Also, we're losing it because a lot of it dries out, loses its nutrients, um, and the soil organisms that recycle those nutrients are lost. It's sort of a positive feedback loop. Also, soil has been lost to compaction. Lots of heavy tractors and bulldozers and things can do things like you see here, and kind of smash down that soil so it can no longer be productive. Dry soil tends to erode more quickly. Usually there's less plants growth, less root structure, and more erosion. Um, Over time, they'll repeatedly growing things will also kind of suck up those key nutrients, and then uh, makes it more difficult to grow future crops without synthetic fertilizers, which then kind of create a problem in themselves when we talk about water pollution. Okay, practice 4.2 FRQ. What I'd like you to do now is design an investigation. So if you had all the money in the world and you worked in a research lab, design an investigation to look at the effect of climate on soil formation. So you could travel anywhere in the world and you could measure anything you want in that lab. I would like you to identify the independent variable and the dependent variable in your experiment. Good luck. All right. Hopefully you got outside and got yourself some soil and sent me that email for extra credit. But if you didn't, we're going to talk a little bit about soil composition and maybe have you do some examination of the soil properties and composition. So what we're going to be looking at is differences between these different properties, focusing on the skill of scientific experimentation. We're going to be talking about things like water holding capacity, fertility, and you'll be able to distinguish between these different horizons of soil. So first, just to remember, soil is inorganic and organic material. It's made up of three particles, sand, silt, and clay, in order of size. The soil texture is determined by the percent of each of those things. This is always going to add up to 100%, typically when they talk about soil texture. Um, Sand, because it has larger pores, it's going to allow more moisture, more air to circulate through. Clay has the lowest what is called porosity, the amount of spaces in between it, and it retains water, and water has a difficult time passing through. So the more clay a soil has, the less likely, again, it's going to drain. So here's a soil texture chart. This is something you're going to have to be familiar with. And basically, it distinguishes between different types of soil based on those compositions of sand, silt, and clay. So here we have an example of a loam soil. It is roughly 40-40-20, or in this case, 45-35 and 20 clay. And what you want to do is use this chart to figure out what kind of soil it is. And I mentioned it was loam. So what the first thing is you do is you go to the bottom. The bottom shows us our percent of sand. And we're going to find 40 right here. And then we're going to go up from 40 until we hit roughly 40% silt. Even 35, we would get the same area right here. And then we're going to look for the percent of clay. And I said in this example, it was 20. So here's 20. So where do those three come together? Right here. And so this is a loam soil. So what I'd like you to do is try to practice by using this mason jar. This is a test you can do at home by putting your soil in some water, and with some soap, it'll separate out. See if you can find out what the sand, percent sand, silt, and clay, and what kind of soil this is. Well, hopefully you got an answer of loam again, because this does also play out to be about the same. So its percents are pretty similar to what we had before. We're going to be talking about more examples of these later. So the next thing is porosity, permeability, and water holding capacity, which will influence a farmer's decisions and what he can grow or what she can grow there. Porosity is the pore spaces within the soil. The more sand, as I mentioned before, the more porous. Typically, the more permeable, the more water can pass through. So obviously porosity and permeability kind of come together. Opposite of this is holding capacity. So water is retained, and usually this is more composite in soil with more clay composition. It's going to have a less likely to allow water to pass through, and so the porosity and the permeability are going to be greatly reduced. Soil that's too sandy for a farmer, oftentimes the water drains so quickly it's very difficult for roots to establish. They get dried out. In contrast, soils that are high in clay become waterlogged. Too much water accumulates in the soil, making it difficult for roots to do respiration, and that water needs to kind of leave the area around the roots. And so ideally for most plants to grow most crops, we look for is loam, again, which is a kind of a mix between that porosity and drainage, and also has a high capacity to hold some of that water. So farmers also have to worry about nutrients. So major nutrients would be things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sodium. Factors that increase those nutrients are things like the organic matter. We talked about the O horizon, the humus layer, decomposer activity. So having the right microbes in your soil is really important. Clay, some percent of that clay is important because those negative charged particles in the clay can help bind to the positive nutrients and hold those nutrients and retain them. Also, you need a certain chemistry. You need some bases present, things like calcium carbonate, limestone. Sometimes farmers will add lime to their fields if their fields are deficient in calcium. So then they can grow more effectively, food more effectively. Factors that decrease our soil nutrients, things like acid leaching. So if there's acid precipitation, those positive charged ions will pull out, the acids, negative charge will pull out those positive charged ion nutrients and actually extract them or leach them through the soil, so they will not be available for plants. Areas that have lots of rainfall, like I mentioned before, the tropics, are very difficult to grow agricultural crops just because of all the excess rain and leaching of nutrients. Farming over and over on land obviously is going to deplete those nutrients as well. Important as nutrients, we also need water. We need soil that is aerated enough, that has a lot of biological activity, aerobic bacteria, and sometimes anaerobic, but mainly aerobic bacteria. Organic matter is really important for holding that moisture. Certain amount of clay content as well. Root structures, usually native plants, kind of work symbiotically to retain water, and can be used in allo cropping as well for farmers. Factors that decrease that water capacity we mentioned before: compacting the soils, topsoil erosion, too much sand in the soil, and root loss. So here is a characteristics and tests of soil quality. This is one of the options for you for your Unit 4 assessment. Is you can do some soil tests, and some of the soil tests you can do are things like texture, and all you need is that jar, and you put the soil in the jar with some water and a little soap, and then you can calculate the percent sand, silt, and clay. You can also measure permeability, so you can take that soil and set it up with a funnel in a system that is going to extract that water and see how long it takes for that water to pass through. This is also very important for farmers. pH, usually measured with pH strips, and that's basically how acidic the soil is. Typically, acidic soils are not as nutrient rich. Color can also tell you a lot about soils. How much water, usually it's a measure of bacterial things like bacteria compositions, if it's anaerobic, or things like oxidation of iron. You can look for reds and blues and different colors and determine the type of soil. And usually the darker it is, more nutrients and the more moisture. And obviously nutrient levels, you look at the things like ammonium nitrate and phosphate levels. And typically you want those in high concentrations. You can obviously go too far with it. Those are the things you need to make sure you measure as a farmer. Okay, your practice 4.3. What I'd like you to do is identify and describe one test that can be conducted on a soil sample. And I'd like you to explain how the results of this test could allow you to give advice to a farmer trying to grow crops in the soil. Good luck. And don't forget, where did your Thanksgiving meal come from? Came from the soil. Came from not the dirt. Not the dirt, the soil. Soil is organic matter and inorganic matter. So don't forget, give thanks to the soil.